Long before seasonal movement, before shelters, before names were given to the land, winter arrived on the continent without interruption. Cold settled gradually, following the shortening of daylight rather than any sudden change. Snow accumulated in layers. Rivers slowed, then locked in place. Wind crossed open ground without resistance, carrying fine ice across plains, coastlines, and high interior valleys. Across what is now North America, winter did not present itself as a single condition. In the far north, darkness extended for weeks. Along the interior plains, temperatures dropped sharply after sunset. Coastal regions faced freezing rain, salt spray, and shifting ice. In forested areas, snow collected beneath trees while temperatures remained low but stable. In other regions, trees did not exist at all. The landscape imposed its rules without urgency. Cold was not an event. It was a state that persisted. Survival, if it occurred, would have to align with that persistence. At this stage, there were no signals of danger. No struggle had yet begun. The environment existed as it always had, indifferent, unchanged, and uninhabited in its response to time. Winter was not a threat. It was simply present. Human adaptation had not yet entered the scene. Human presence in cold regions did not emerge as an experiment. It developed gradually, across thousands of years, as populations adapted to environments others avoided. By the time sustained winter settlement became visible in the archaeological record, survival strategies were already established. Across the northern half of the continent, indigenous societies occupied environments ranging from boreal forest to open tundra. Along the coasts and islands of the Arctic, communities lived where trees were absent and temperatures remained below freezing for much of the year. Farther south, interior peoples faced long winters marked by wind, snow, and seasonal scarcity rather than permanent ice. Each region imposed different constraints, but all required preparation rather than reaction. These societies were not defined by cold alone. They were defined by continuity. Generations remained in the same territories, refining seasonal movement, food storage, and shelter design. Knowledge accumulated slowly. Mistakes were not repeated. What did not work was abandoned. What sustained life was retained. Winter survival was not treated as an isolated challenge. It was one phase of an annual cycle. Hunting, clothing manufacture, and shelter construction occurred months in advance. Mobility patterns were adjusted to ensure that winter camps were established before rivers froze or snow made travel unreliable. The people who lived in these regions were not responding to crisis conditions. They were maintaining systems designed for predictability. Cold, darkness, and limited resources were expected. Survival depended on reducing exposure rather than resisting the environment directly. Fire was present in many regions, but it was not always reliable. In areas without trees, fuel had to be gathered from animal fat, driftwood, or dried vegetation. In others, storms or snow could temporarily eliminate access to usable wood. These limitations shaped alternative methods of warmth that did not depend on constant combustion. The historical record does not present winter as an enemy to be conquered. It presents winter as a condition to be accommodated. Communities that endured did so not by altering the landscape, but by altering daily behavior, social organization, and material culture to match it. Understanding how these societies survived cold winters requires setting aside modern assumptions. The absence of abundant firewood did not equate to vulnerability. It required a different form of planning, one rooted in observation rather than intervention. In many regions of North America, winter survival unfolded in landscapes where wood was scarce or entirely absent. The northern tundra, coastal ice margins, and parts of the interior plains offered little combustible material. Trees did not regenerate quickly in frozen soil. In some areas, they did not grow at all. Along the far northern coastlines and islands of the Arctic, driftwood sometimes arrived with ocean currents, but its presence was unpredictable. Storms could deposit it one year and remove it the next. Inland tundra regions relied on low shrubs, grasses, and animal remains, none of which provided steady heat when burned. In such conditions, Fire could not be treated as a constant resource. The absence of timber shaped settlement patterns. Winter camps were selected based on wind exposure, snow accumulation, and proximity to food rather than access to fuel. Shelters were placed in areas where natural insulation existed, against embankments, within snowdrifts, or in shallow depressions that reduced airflow. These decisions reduced the need for internal heat. Ethnographic accounts and archaeological findings indicate that fire, when used, served limited functions. It was employed for cooking when fuel was available, or for tool maintenance, rather than as a primary source of warmth. In enclosed shelters, open flames introduced risk. Smoke accumulation could reduce oxygen. Heat escaped quickly through poorly insulated structures. Survival strategies therefore shifted away from reliance on burning materials. Warmth was generated and retained through other means. Body heat became a resource to be conserved. Shelter design focused on minimizing heat loss. Clothing functioned as insulation rather than decoration. Diets emphasized fat, which increased metabolic heat during digestion. These adaptations did not emerge from a single innovation. They developed through observation and long-term testing. Communities learned where snow packed most densely. They learned how wind behaved across open ground. They learned which materials retained heat and which failed. Life without timber did not mean life without warmth. It required redefining how warmth was produced and maintained. Fire, when absent, was replaced by systems that worked continuously rather than temporarily. These systems did not depend on flames. They depended on control, restraint, and accumulation. By the time winter fully set in, reliance on firewood had already been reduced to a secondary concern. The transition into deep winter was not marked by a single moment. It unfolded over weeks, sometimes months, as familiar movement gradually narrowed. Rivers that once served as travel routes slowed, then hardened. Coastal waters filled with ice that shifted but did not open. Snow accumulated beyond the point where walking remained efficient. At a certain stage, relocation ceased to be practical. For communities living in the northern interior and the Arctic, this transition represented a threshold rather than a crisis. Winter camps had already been selected. Supplies had already been gathered. The remaining task was to remain in place. Once this threshold was crossed, isolation became unavoidable. Hunting territories contracted. Long-distance travel increased risk without increasing reward. The margin for error narrowed. A torn garment, a damaged shelter wall, or a poorly preserved food cache could no longer be corrected by relocation. This period marked the point of no return in the seasonal cycle. Decisions made earlier now carried their full weight. There was no opportunity to compensate for shortages through movement. Survival depended on what had already been secured and how efficiently it could be used. Environmental pressure increased without spectacle. Temperatures dropped incrementally. Wind exposure became constant. Darkness extended daily. These changes did not provoke immediate danger, but they reduced tolerance for inefficiency. Heat loss that might have been manageable in early winter now accumulated. Fat reserves diminished steadily. Small failures became cumulative. Fire, where available, played a limited role during this phase. Fuel sources were conserved rather than consumed. Flames were brief and controlled. In many shelters, they were absent altogether. Warmth had to be sustained without fluctuation. The winter threshold did not announce itself. It was recognized through constraint. When movement stopped, when resources could no longer be replenished, and when daily routines narrowed to preservation rather than acquisition, winter had fully arrived. From this point forward, survival was no longer about preparation. It was about management. Every action occurred within a closed system. Nothing entered it. Nothing left without consequence. Once winter conditions stabilized, shelter became the primary mechanism of warmth. In regions where firewood was limited or absent, protection from heat loss mattered more than heat generation. Archaeological evidence and historical observation show that shelter design reflected this priority with consistency across cold region societies. In the northern tundra and coastal areas of the Arctic, compact snow structures provided insulation rather than exposure. Snow, when densely packed, trapped air and slowed heat transfer. Interior temperatures in these shelters remained significantly warmer than outside conditions, even without internal fire. Entrances were constructed low and narrow, forcing cold air to settle below the living space. Sleeping platforms were elevated, separating occupants from the coldest layer of air. Farther south, where snow accumulation varied, earth-covered lodges and semi-subterranean dwellings served a similar function. Soil acted as a thermal buffer. These structures were partially embedded in the ground, reducing surface area exposed to wind. Roofs were layered with sod, hides, or packed vegetation. Heat loss occurred slowly and predictably. Mobility influenced shelter design as well. Temporary winter structures were constructed with materials available at the site and abandoned once conditions allowed movement again. Permanence was not required. Efficiency was. Construction favored repeatable methods that minimized time spent exposed to cold. Communal living further reduced heat loss. Multiple occupants shared confined spaces, allowing body heat to accumulate. This arrangement also reduced the need for individual shelters, conserving materials and labor. Ethnographic records indicate that winter camps often consisted of closely grouped dwellings, positioned to block wind and reduce exposure. Interior conditions were controlled rather than heated. Ventilation openings were minimal and adjusted carefully to balance oxygen flow with heat retention. Moisture management was critical. Excess humidity reduced insulation effectiveness and increased the risk of freezing. Drying garments inside shelters was done selectively, often by body heat alone. Shelter maintenance became a daily task. Snow walls were repaired after storms. Structural weaknesses were reinforced before failure occurred. These actions were preventative rather than reactive. Once a shelter lost its insulating properties, replacing it during deep winter became difficult or impossible. In the absence of reliable firewood, shelter functioned as stored heat. It captured what the body produced and prevented its escape. This approach required precision, not intensity. Warmth was achieved not by raising temperature, but by slowing its loss. By midwinter, shelter was no longer just a place to rest. It was an active system, maintained continuously, upon which survival depended. In environments where external heat could not be relied upon, clothing became the primary interface between the body and cold. Its function extended beyond coverage. It regulated temperature, managed moisture, and reduced wind exposure. For many indigenous societies in cold regions, clothing systems were as critical as shelter. Animal hides and furs provided insulation through trapped air. Caribou, bison, seal, and other animals produced skins with hollow or dense hair structures that slowed heat transfer. These materials were selected based on local availability and seasonal performance rather than appearance. Winter garments differed from those used during warmer months, often featuring thicker hides and multiple layers. Layering was systematic. An inner layer absorbed moisture. Outer layers blocked wind and repelled snow. Loose construction allowed air to circulate between layers, increasing insulation. Tight clothing restricted movement and compressed insulating material, reducing effectiveness. These principles were applied consistently across regions, as evidenced by preserved garments and early ethnographic accounts. Garment construction emphasized repairability. Seams were placed to minimize stress. Stitching used sinew, which expanded when damp and sealed needle holes. Damage was addressed immediately. A torn seam or worn section increased heat loss and risk of frost injury. Maintenance was part of daily routine, particularly during periods of reduced activity. Footwear required special attention. Heat loss through the feet occurred rapidly during travel or prolonged standing. Boots were insulated with fur lining and designed to be dried regularly. In regions of the Arctic, detachable liners allowed moisture to be removed without exposing the wearer to cold. Footwear was adjusted to conditions rather than standardized. Head and face coverings reduced exposure in high wind. Frostbite affected uncovered skin quickly, especially in sub-zero temperatures. Hoods were shaped to limit airflow without restricting vision. Face protection varied by activity, balancing breath moisture with insulation. Clothing did not eliminate cold. It reduced its impact to a manageable level. Combined with shelter, it allowed the body to maintain core temperature without continuous external heat. Fire, when available, served as a supplement rather than a requirement. Diet and movement interacted with clothing effectiveness. Physical activity generated heat that clothing retained. During periods of rest, additional layers were added. This flexibility allowed individuals to regulate temperature without changing environment. The effectiveness of these systems is reflected in their longevity. Designs remained stable over generations, suggesting refinement rather than experimentation. Clothing was not improvised in response to crisis. It was produced in advance, tested repeatedly, and relied upon when conditions left no margin for error. In the coldest months, clothing functioned as portable shelter. It allowed survival during travel, work, and rest. Without it, shelter alone would not have been sufficient. In cold environments where external heat was limited, internal heat production became essential. Food served this function as much as it provided sustenance. The winter diets of indigenous communities in northern and subarctic regions reflected this requirement with consistency. Caloric density mattered more than variety. Animal fat provided more energy per unit than lean meat or plant foods. Diets emphasized species and cuts that maximized fat intake. In coastal and tundra regions of the Arctic, marine mammals and fish supplied high levels of fat. Inland, large land mammals such as caribou and bison served the same role. Fat was consumed deliberately rather than incidentally. Preservation methods ensured availability throughout winter. Meat and fat were dried, frozen, or stored in cold conditions that inhibited spoilage. In some cases, fermentation occurred in controlled environments. These processes did not require fuel. They relied on ambient temperature and time. Food caches were placed where animals were unlikely to reach them and where temperature remained stable. Winter diets differed from those of other seasons. Plant foods became scarce or inaccessible. Stored berries, roots, and seeds supplemented animal products when available, but they did not form the nutritional base. The body's ability to generate heat depended on consistent caloric intake. Periods of shortage reduced tolerance to cold quickly. Consumption patterns were adapted to activity levels. During periods of movement or labor, intake increased. During extended rest, consumption was moderated but not eliminated. This regulation prevented exhaustion of reserves before winter ended. Historical accounts from early observers often misunderstood these diets, describing them as excessive or unbalanced. Modern nutritional analysis, however, indicates that high-fat intake supported sustained energy output and heat production under extreme conditions. Protein alone did not meet these needs. Food sharing within winter camps reduced individual risk. A successful hunt benefited the group rather than a single household. This system stabilized access and reduced the impact of temporary scarcity. It also reinforced communal living arrangements that contributed to heat retention. Failure in food management had immediate consequences. Weight loss reduced insulation. Fatigue increased injury risk. Recovery during winter was difficult. These pressures reinforced strict discipline in storage, portioning, and consumption. Food, like shelter and clothing, was part of an integrated system. It did not function independently. Metabolic heat replaced external fire where fuel was limited. Survival depended on sustaining that process without interruption. By midwinter, energy intake became as important as protection from wind or snow. Without sufficient fuel, the body itself could no longer serve as a heat source. Even with refined systems of shelter, clothing, and diet, winter imposed limits that could not always be avoided. Archaeological evidence and historical records indicate that cold-related injury and death remained part of life in northern environments. Survival strategies reduced risk. They did not eliminate it. Frostbite occurred during travel, hunting, or prolonged exposure. Fingers, toes, and facial tissue were most vulnerable. Severe cases led to permanent injury or loss of function. Recovery was slow and often incomplete. In deep winter, reduced mobility increased dependence on others and limited contribution to daily tasks. Illness compounded these risks. Respiratory infections spread easily in enclosed shelters. Limited ventilation, while necessary for heat retention, increased exposure. Weakness reduced the body's ability to generate heat, creating a cycle that was difficult to reverse once it began. Food shortages occurred despite planning. Weather disrupted hunting. Ice conditions changed unexpectedly. Animal migrations varied from year to year. When fat reserves declined, tolerance to cold dropped rapidly. Weight loss reduced insulation. Fatigue impaired judgment. Small errors became critical. Historical accounts from the Arctic and subarctic describe winters where loss was accepted without ceremony. Death did not arrive suddenly. It followed gradual decline. The body slowed. Movement decreased. Activity narrowed. At a certain point, recovery was no longer possible. These outcomes were not treated as failure of the system. They were understood as part of environmental constraint. Survival strategies extended life expectancy under severe conditions, but they did not guarantee survival in every case. Variability in weather, health, and resource availability remained decisive. Psychological strain increased as winter progressed. Darkness altered perception of time. Routine became repetitive. The margin for change disappeared. Ethnographic records describe reduced movement and speech during the coldest months, conserving energy and attention. Despite these pressures, communities maintained structure. Tasks continued as long as possible. Care for the injured persisted within available capacity. Loss did not disrupt the system. It was absorbed into it. By late winter, the cumulative effects of cold were visible. Bodies carried evidence of endurance and limitation. Survival, where it occurred, reflected balance rather than dominance. Winter did not yield. It simply loosened its hold when seasons changed. As winter cycles ended and spring returned, surviving communities emerged from isolation with lessons carried forward. The systems of shelter, clothing, and food management persisted, refined across generations. Knowledge was embedded in daily routines and material culture rather than written records. European contact introduced new tools, metals, and occasionally additional fuel sources. Some communities adapted these resources to existing systems, improving efficiency. Snow shelters could be supplemented with stoves. Clothing could incorporate cloth or metal fasteners, and stored food could benefit from containers that retained heat or moisture better. These changes altered routines but did not replace fundamental survival principles. Winter remained a condition to accommodate rather than conquer. Continuity depended on observation and practice. Elders guided younger members in construction, clothing preparation, and food handling. Skills were tested annually. Survival was not heroic in the dramatic sense. It was procedural, repetitive, and disciplined. Mortality in winter persisted, though gradually reduced in areas where supplemental tools or trade became available. Survival strategies, refined over centuries, ensured that knowledge remained effective despite shifting circumstances. Winter survival was never absolute, but it remained reliable enough to sustain community life. Through these continuities and adjustments, the people of cold regions preserved both life and knowledge, leaving a record of human adaptation under conditions of consistent environmental constraint. The endurance of northern communities demonstrates the integration of observation, skill, and adaptation. Winter was not defeated. It was accommodated through shelter, clothing, diet, and routine. Knowledge accumulated slowly, carried across generations, and transmitted quietly through practice rather than proclamation. The survival of these societies highlights human capacity to exist within extreme conditions without reliance on abundant external resources. Cold was a constant, shaping life rather than threatening it. In understanding these systems, the historical record reveals not struggle for conquest, but the steady, disciplined presence of people attuned to their environment. Winter passed. Knowledge remained.